We're going into the fourth and final section now called Next Steps. And in there are a number of things we can do. It depends on what you want to do with it. It could be that we talk about multiple takings of this, which you've done, and then the discrepancy between a year and a half ago and now. It could be that we talk about you have the people, your students, take it on you and give you feedback as to how they see you. It could be colleagues that take it and you talk about it with colleagues. It could be any number of things. But I want to start with something that comes out of the dilemma you face in here in some way. You said at the end of the third section, that there are serious consequences for not getting things right. So that burden for you means laying a foundation that is really true to the law and to any further negotiations about the law. That's true in so many professions. And so you have the obligation of an authentic, accurate, firm foundation. But your real intentionality is to get them to do something with that rather than just get that. That is such a common struggle. So let's talk about how you might wrestle with that. Are you familiar with a flipped classroom?
No.
Okay. A flipped classroom idea is that, let's say you normally lecture on these things, and they come out of good readings and they've done some reading on it, but your obligation is to lecture on these things and give emphasis to some things and give structure to some things, point out how some other things are related to each other. A flipped classroom would have you give them the critical things to read, then have them submit to you questions or issues that emerge out of those for which they need to discuss things further with you. So you really remove yourself from presenting that material to discussing that material. But it stays true to the material because you give them the most critical things to read before they ever come into the room with you. Now, let's say the most difficult circumstances would be a conference. Now, if you've only got a few hours, you said, with someone at a conference, sometime earlier on you said I have sometimes a few hours with someone. That would be difficult there. But where you have people for any period of time, I think if you flip it around and put the obligation on them to do the prior reading of something that is the foundational knowledge, then have them come in and not only tell you what the issues are or the problems or the questions, give them cases. And listen to the way they use the material to reason their way through the cases.
Okay.
And then what you do in that is really important. You reposition your knowledge in relation to their knowledge. When you come in as a lecturer, you position your knowledge up front. You take the obligation of saying everything they need to know. That's a huge obligation. And it then intrudes on the time you want for them to actually wrestle with this. So remove that positionality of the knowledge and reposition your knowledge to be in response to how they apply that knowledge to a case, a problem, a situation, or whatever. Can you do that?
Yeah, I could. And I have a question for you. How do you keep them from going off on a tangent or going so off track with the readings or the information? Are there any kind of parameters or things you can do to make sure that it's kept more of a narrow focus?
Sure. Let's say you've just done that. And you're sitting over here and you've raised an issue that seems to me really in left field.
Right.
First thing I'd do is I'd say, Tom, before we answer that, let me see how many of the rest of the people in the room see that as an issue for them. Does anybody else see that as their central issue right now? Tom, it seems like that's an issue for you, but it isn't anyone else's issue right now. How about you and I talk about that later?
Okay.
Let's go on to something else. I haven't dismissed you, but neither have I taken your issue and made it everybody's issue when it's nobody else's issue.
Okay.
So there are ways to not disrespect the person, but not abuse the rest of the people either.
So you make it more of a democratic environment.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so we're in this last section about next steps, and before I go through other things, what do you think you would like to do next to take you further into understanding? Where we started was, you started by saying, I'm not sure what kind of teacher I want to be, and within that, let me add another one, I'm not sure how effective I am being the teacher I want to be. How might you follow up on those?
It's difficult because in my job and in my field, we are a social movement, and social reform is part of that. So I struggle with, okay, the ultimate goal for my organization is to create social awareness and a change in consciousness, whether it's workers' compensation, disability management, minority rights, doesn't matter what it is. should that be the circle that goes around everything? Should it be part of my day-to-day teaching? Should I aspire to become more involved in the one perspective? What is the end goal? And does that interfere with or impede my ability to get people through X, Y, and Z, get them out there in the street, make them feel competent?
So if I understand what you just said, it refers to the social reform perspective.
Yes.
And in that, it refers to one of the assumptions in that perspective is that teaching is a moral responsibility. That is, it deals with issues of justice, privilege, and doing the right thing for the right reasons. In our database, only 3% of people have that as their dominant perspective. Their dominant perspective. But as I said at the beginning, you are all 5 of these to some extent. If you had that as your dominant perspective, you would likely be out of a job where you live and where you work. It is so on the margins that you would have to find a way to still do the work you're hired to do according to those who hire you and those who come to your classes, that you might actually lose the opportunity to raise the issues you want to raise. So you don't have to be dominant in that to still deal with the critical issues you just mentioned. They can be in the cases. They can be in the reasoning about the cases. So you can foreground the reasoning and still have some of the issues be moral issues of justice.
So you mentioned the split classroom approach style. Would it be possible to build that into the questions or as a guideline to the questions that will eventually be asked later on? Could that be a component where I give the material, I give the cases, and I'm soliciting questions from people which will guide further conversation in a couple hours or the next day, but also build social reform into it?
Sure. I would imagine some of the cases raise really fundamental issues that are moral issues.
Mm-hmm.
I would leave those in there. They're important. And let them emerge from the conversation. That's the basic difference there between the flipped classroom and a straight lecture classroom.
Okay.
If there's a moral issue in there and no one raises that as a moral issue, then you probably have a responsibility to raise it as a moral issue. But if someone in the group raises it and raises the morality of the issue, whatever it might be, you're far better positioned to have a conversation about it than if you raise it and no one else does. Okay. Let it come from them, and it has peer authority to it.
As opposed to me putting out there an agenda or looking artificial.
When you put it out as an agenda, and you can eventually, but I think you distance yourself from people if you put it out too soon. They haven't come for that. They didn't put that on the foreground of why they've enrolled in this in some way. Most likely, I'm guessing, I don't know.
You're right.
So I don't think you want to push them away too soon on a very critical issue. In fact, you want to keep them embraced in that issue. So position the issue after they've got a chance to talk about other issues, but also so that someone can raise that as an issue. Then it's always a matter, this is the fundamental thing, reposition your authority as well as your knowledge. Don't always lead with it. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because of where you stand. What I'm saying is particular to having nurturing and developmental as the 2 strongest perspectives in your profile. If social reform was dominant, we would have a different conversation. Mm-hmm. But it isn't. I don't think you know how to teach that way. I really don't. So I want you to be successful with who you are rather than try to be someone else. So repositioning your knowledge and your authority fits really, to be in response to what they ask, what they say, fits beautifully with the combination of nurturing and developmental.
Great. That makes sense. Okay. It's just a struggle that I have, and it's an organizational objective to make these kinds of things happen. That's what unions and other organizations are about. But how to build that in while at the same time satisfying people's needs and wants. Well, I came here expecting to have takeaways and to learn about this and have practical skills and knowledge.
Yeah. So let's close this off with one last thing. Let's say that you want to get some feedback on whether or not this is how people see you. Mm-hmm. This is how you say you see you. No one else has told us this is who Tom is. There are two really easy ways to do that, or common ways to do that. One is if you have an ongoing class with people, not just a one-off conference thing. At some point, let's say at least halfway through, maybe even further on, you could have your students go online and take this about your teaching them this topic. Then they don't put in their email address to get the results. Instead, they put in your email address. Now, what happens with that? Well, first of all, you get a flood of emails with profiles. And you open them up and you can compare and say, oh my gosh, well, I see some people see me the same way I do and others see me differently. The second thing, which is really critical, you don't know who said what, because nobody has put in any identifiers for themselves. They put in your name and your email address. So it's completely anonymous. So that gives you some real feedback on how your students see you. But a second way that's equally useful is if you've got two other colleagues, and I say at least two, because a conversation of three people is better than just two. Have them take it. If you're teaching the same thing particularly, if you're teaching the same thing, have two colleagues take this instrument and then sit down and have a conversation about how you teach it. Because this is a conversation tool, not a diagnostic tool. Okay?
And that's one big thing for me. When I first took it the first time, I took it as a reflection on, this is who I am, and it's set in stone for all of eternity. And it's not. It changes over time. I evolve, it evolves. It's context dependent. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right.